Mihi nui kia Danielle Wood, te kaikorero o te rā. Tēnā koe, Danielle. No mai haere mai ki te tai ohanga. Big welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us here in the room. And also I know we have a number of people who are online for today's Treasury guest lecture. And a very warm welcome to our presenter, Danielle Wood, the Chair of the Australian Productivity Commission. Welcome to Wellington, Danielle. It's really wonderful to host you here, and we look forward to your presentation today. Through this guest lecture series, the Treasury, we're aiming to foster debate, to generate some insight, some challenge on some of the big issues that matter for New Zealand. And today's lecture is on competition policy. I think we can all agree that's a highly topical subject, so really looking forward to it. A couple of points of hygiene, quick health and safety briefing for those who are in the room. In the event of a fire alarm, please follow the Treasury staff to the nearest exit and progress down the stairs. Do not use the lift. In the event of an earthquake, please drop, cover and hold. And bathrooms can be found to the left-hand side of the kitchenette. So I am delighted to introduce Danielle Wood, who is the Chair of the Australian Productivity Commission. She's held that role since November last year. Prior to joining the Commission, Danielle was the CEO of the Grattan Institute and its Head of Budgets and Government Program. During her time at Grattan, she also held roles as member of the Australian Government's Women's Economic Equality Taskforce, the Parliamentary Budget Office Expert Advisory Committee, which I also sat on, some great conversations there, Jobs and Skills Australia Consultative Forum, and the Australian New Zealand School of Government Research Committee. She is an honorary fellow and former president of the Economic Society of Australia and the co-founder and first chair of the Women in Economics Network, which the New Zealand Treasury is an enthusiastic supporter of. I have long admired Danielle's work. She is a really influential economic leader, and I'm just delighted that she can join us here today. So today, Danielle's going to look at the reasons why competition policy has regained popularity in developed economies. She's going to examine the current debate in Australia and other countries about the potential role of competition policy as a tool for boosting economic dynamism, for boosting productivity and economic growth. The Australian Productivity Commission that currently have an inquiry underway looking at the impact of proposed changes to the Australian National Competition Policy. It's planned for delivery, I think, in November this year. And it's a topic, of course, of great relevance for New Zealand. We have a long-standing productivity challenge with weak productivity growth relative to OECD peers and also slowing productivity growth along with our OECD peers. We are uniquely small, geographically isolated, have relatively low trade and foreign direct investment relative to GDP, and as a result, New Zealand firms face weak competition, compounded at times by regulatory obstacles and high public ownership and other competition settings. Earlier this year, the OECD survey included a chapter on competition, which suggests that our current competition settings are one of the contributors to New Zealand's poor economic and productivity performance. So ensuring that our competition settings are fit for purpose, also in the face of a number of global changes, from rapid technological change to geopolitical and climate change, ensuring that we have the right competition settings really matters for productivity and for economic prosperity here. So really interested in your presentation, Danielle. We've got about 30 minutes for Danielle to present, and we'll allow for questions and answers after that. Use the Q&A functions in Teams, so please post your questions there, and we'll try and alternate between the room and online. So over to you, Danielle. Welcome.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Carolee, and thank you all for coming along. It's very nice to have a full audience, although everyone's avoiding the front row, I notice, so don't bite. So as Carolee has said, what I was hoping to do today is reflect on what I think has been a bit of a swing back to talking and thinking about competition policy in broader economic circles. I used to work once upon a time at the competition regulator in Australia, and it's always been a passionate conversation in those narrow rooms, but I think it's very much kind of featuring in broader debates now. So I want to talk about the context for that. I'll talk a little bit about the kind of emerging evidence which has been important in Australia. And then I want to talk about Competition Taskforce, which has been set up by the Australian government, and the kind of three big pillars of things that it's moving on, which is mergers law, non-compete clauses in labour contracts, and as Carolee has foreshadowed, the kind of revitalisation of national competition policy. So let me start super broad, and I know I probably don't have to convince anyone in this room of this, but we have had this extraordinary growth in living standards globally over past decades, and particularly if we look at Western countries, Western Europe and the Western offshoots, including Australia and New Zealand, really since World War II, this explosion in real per person material living standards. And a key driver of that has been the extraordinary productivity growth we've experienced over that time. What you see in the kind of more recent period, obviously the COVID dip is evident, but a kind of tapering off of those improvements. And it's a little more evident or explicit in this chart. This looks specifically at labour productivity growth in the 15 years prior to COVID, and compares that to the 15 years before that, which is the older data is in the light blue. And what you see in almost every single OECD nation, we've had a substantial step down in productivity growth across those two periods. So you can see Australia there in green, New Zealand is a few over to the right. As Carolee said, particularly acute challenge in the recent period. And that has got economists, really trying to understand why it is that we seem to have seen this kind of across the board downward shift. And my reading of the literature is there's kind of a number of issues that are in the frame. One is just the sort of structural shift within economies. As economies get richer, they tend to shift both consumption and labour towards services sectors. Historically, they have had lower productivity growth, and that drags on the overall productivity performance. We've seen less of a gain from technological change, which is kind of hard to grapple with when it feels like technology is evolving so rapidly. But at least to date, the ICT revolution hasn't been as transformative for productivity as previous waves of technological change. That may change in the future, but that is, in a backward-looking sense, that seems to be true. Third is we're seeing slowing gains from human capital accumulation. So we had a big ramp up, as I think is true here as well, through the 80s and 90s of more students finishing high school, more students going on to post-school education. You kind of only get to do that once, and then the incremental gains become smaller. We were having a conversation this morning about education quality, then kind of becomes more of the conversation rather than quantity. And the final kind of common point across these countries is a reduction in economic dynamism. And by that, I mean the kind of capacity of economies to move resources around from lower productivity to higher productivity parts. So this is about labour mobility, this is about investment and entrepreneurialism. And with that discussion of economic dynamism, people have started to make observations that competition looks like it is on the decline in a range of countries around the world. So a lot of this work started in the US, and there was evidence coming out of US markets. This is from the IMF, which is aggregating across a series of countries. But you see in the kind of post-2010 world, some uptick in market concentration, some uptick in profitability, and then an increase in markups across the period. So it's those kind of facts together that have got people excited or interested in competition policy again. So we've had central banks getting into the question, multilateral organisations like the IMF, and then finally political leadership across the world is increasingly engaging in questions of competition policy. So let me talk now about some of the relevant data for Australia. We start from a place where we just have a lot more concentrated markets than the US. And I imagine if I was to put the same slide up for New Zealand, it would be more concentrated again. So this is looking at the top 4 firms in each industry by sales share. And then you can see we've got many markets where the top 4 account for the majority of sales, and certainly a lot more concentrated than our peers in the United States. We are also seeing that same trend that we were talking about globally, that we're seeing an increase in concentration across a range of markets. So the HHI index is a measure of concentration across a market. What we're seeing is across a range of industries, as you can see, that's increasing over time. And if we aggregate that up across the Australian economy, you can see again that kind of late 2000s period towards 2010 kind of creeping up of these different indexes of market concentration. And, sometimes the line is, well, market concentration isn't, of course, a direct measure of competition. We care about things like entry barriers and if people can come in easily, it may be disciplining the firms in the market. So it is concerning, I think, this one, to see that it seems that the firms at the top of the markets have become more entrenched over time. So we're not getting the same amount of turnover that we used to at the top of the market. So if you take the firms at the top and you look in 2 years and then in 4 years, we've had less movement in that group over time across the economy over the past 15 or so years. Sitting alongside that, markups have also crept up. Here, I know I'm going to have a lot of economists in the audience, so I will put disclaimers on this. These are not, economic measures of markups. We have essentially accounting data sets, and they try and make assumptions to back out markups from those data sets. So, they're not in any way perfect measure, but it is telling us something about what is happening over time. When we split that out between digitally intensive industries and other sectors, we see a much stronger trend in those sectors that rely on significant digital investments. So that's kind of the set of stylised facts about competition. And I want to come to the market dynamism question. As I said before, market dynamism you can think of really as just the way in which resources, or how easily resources, move across the economy. And here we see reasonably similar trends in Australia that are picked up in the international literature. Firm entry before COVID was trending downwards. That is sort of a measure of entrepreneurialism. New firms entering the market was in decline. COVID played some havoc with the data, with a whole range of government supports and changes to insolvency laws that are introduced, but the kind of longer term trend is clear. We had a sort of slight decline in firm exit rates, not as pronounced as some countries where there was a lot of talk of zombie firms that were sort of kept alive in a low interest rate environment. We didn't see quite the same effect, but slightly evident in the data. And labour mobility is a really important one. You can see, what looks like to be quite a long-term decline in people switching jobs. Some of that is an ageing population effect. So older people tend to switch jobs less. And so if your population is ageing, that kind of puts downward pressure on the rate, but it's not the only thing that's going on. We see, even if we look at particular cohorts, so if we look at job switching amongst young people, that has slowed compared to 10 or 15 years ago. You do see a slight uptick with COVID. I don't know if you had the conversation here, but everyone was talking about the Great Resignation. That was a lot of the consulting firms were really saying this was going to be a big thing. So we see it, but it's small, and certainly much smaller than places like the United States, where that was a more genuine trend in the data. The other really important point for productivity is investment has been stagnant over an extended period, somewhat masked in Australia by the fact that we did have a capital investment boom in our mining sector, which drives a lot of what's going on. But even there, you can see tapered off in recent years. And again, this has been a global phenomenon and probably a surprising phenomenon for many people. If you remember the decade between GFC and COVID, we had interest rates coming down really rapidly, and the kind of lack of investment response was surprising for many. There's probably some good macroeconomists here, but there are macro theories about this, about kind of low demand traps and getting stuck there. There's also, some interesting micro theories around the rise of intangibles in markets. So maybe we just have less capital investment now when we're investing in other things that may not always be captured in the data around perhaps risk aversion, overhang following the global financial crisis. And the other interesting one, which I'm seeing some relevant studies on now, is the ageing of the shareholder base of companies and what that does for incentives for companies to put profits back out via things like share buybacks versus longer term investments. And you can imagine that kind of preferences shift as your shareholder base changes in age. But bottom line is I'm not sure we've really got to the bottom of that phenomenon, and I think it's crucially important for the story. As I said, the story is really one of substantially lower productivity growth in Australia. That meant that decade between GFC and COVID, the lowest growth that we had seen in productivity over the 10-year, over a 60-year time horizon. And on top of this as well, I think this has gained a lot of interest publicly because it has coincided with a period of pretty stagnant wages growth. And, you know, that's to be expected. Labour productivity and wages move together over the long term. And so if you have a period of stagnant productivity, you expect to see wages growth slow. But in addition to that, in that period, we've actually had some degree of decoupling between productivity and wages growth. It's less pronounced if I strip out mining and agriculture. They have their kind of own dynamic and they're very volatile, but we still see to some degree this decoupling in wages again, which has been identified in other countries. So when you kind of take these stylised facts together, we've seen what seems to be an increase in market concentration across a lot of the economy, what seems to be a reduction in economic dynamism. People have been really keen to draw the link. This is Andrew Leigh, who's our competition minister, and he's really been kind of leading the charge on this, saying we should care about this decline in competition because it is linked with the decline in economic dynamism and therefore productivity. So that kind of economic lens has been driving a lot of the activity within the government. I just want to briefly unpack that for a minute. First of all, in a theoretical basis, we can kind of understand the mechanisms by which this could play out. Competition can affect pressure on firms to invest and innovate. Imagine if you're under competitive pressure, it can drive a lot of those behaviours as opposed to being kind of relaxed and comfortable. When we're talking about economic dynamism, movement of resources across firms in competitive markets, you'd expect high productivity firms to be out competing and drawing resources from low productivity firms. And then to those questions of distribution that I was talking about before, the labour market impacts. In a market that's highly competitive, there'll be more competitive tension for labour between firms to pass on those productivity gains. Our Treasury have spent a lot of time looking at this and popping it through their macro models. They estimate that if we took our economy back to the competition levels that applied in the early 2000s, GDP could be 1% to 3% higher, which, as we all know, is worth getting out of bed for. What I would say is the kind of causal literature is still building. So we've got the kind of two stylised facts about what's going on with competition and what's going on with dynamism. There are some papers that are now starting to kind of link those two things, and I've put the references here if you are interested in them, but it's no means a kind of complete literature at this stage. I would argue further research is needed, both in terms of some of those measurement issues that I pointed to around markups, but also the broader empirical base. In the US, they've started drilling down into some of these measures by industry and by region, and they're not finding the same strength of effects that you find at the more macro level. So that's a little caveat on this. Now, as we know, as decision makers, we are always working in environments of incomplete information. My takeout is we should therefore look at competition policy and we should think about it and make changes where it makes sense. But this is not kind of at the stage where it's throw the baby out with the bathwater and say the whole thing's gone terribly wrong. So where has that taken us? It has been a big part of the economic debate, as I have flagged, and there is a range of things going on. If you want to get your nerd on, I do recommend the Parliamentary inquiry into promoting economic dynamism and competition. It was led by one of our Labor backbenchers who's got a PhD in economics, and he really got into it and put a lot of effort into documenting some of these trends, and as well as exploring policy solutions. Grocery industry has been very much in the frame, which obviously ties in with cost of living pressures and where those are felt. And I know the same arguments, the same debates are going on here. We've had a review of our food and grocery code of conduct with a recommendation to move it from a voluntary to a mandatory code. That's about how the supermarkets negotiate with their suppliers. There's an ongoing inquiry of our competition regulator into supermarket prices and competition. They've just finished one on childcare pricing, which was another very hot topic. We've also had some more extreme measures coming into debates. Our opposition party has announced it will introduce a divestiture power for supermarkets if it gets elected. A couple of other things that I've neglected to put there. State governments, Victoria, where I'm based, has announced a government-owned electricity company to compete with the private sector companies. And in Queensland, which is having an election at the moment, the opposition leader has said if they get back in power, the Labor Premier has said if they get back in power, they will roll out government-owned service stations to compete in fuel markets. So it's going to some quite strong places. But I think a much more sort of constructive component of the debate has been the Competition Taskforce. So that was established within our Treasury mid last year. And what I really want to talk about is how it looks pretty different to what's gone before in terms of policy reviews in this space. The two biggies in Australian history and competition policy have been the Hilmer Review and the Harper Review, and we love naming our reviews after the chairs that have run those, but they were very broad-ranging. They spanned competition law, access regulation, the institutions, whole lots of kind of anti-competitive regulation. This task force is a lot more targeted and a lot more strategic in the way that it's kind of going about its work. So as I said, based in the Australian Treasury, I would argue well-resourced. You would no doubt argue well-resourced, about 50 or so staff working on it. There's an expert panel of which I am one member. I think there's 6 other members, a nice mix of, we've got a former ACCC chair, a couple of business leaders, some overseas academic experts. And the expert panel is just providing advice as the task force goes about its work. And what they've done is picked off areas to, not just research, but really try and drill down and deliver policy change on. So I want to talk about the 3 biggies, starting with mergers and acquisitions reform. You can imagine mergers laws kind of came into the frame based on the discussion I had before about rising concentration. People are saying, well, are our mergers laws fit for purpose? We've also had a competition regulator who's been very active over a number of years of making the case that they don't think the mergers laws were working as they should. And really they have kind of 3 key critiques. One is that as a voluntary regime and as a regime that doesn't require firms to wait to complete their merger until the ACCC assessment has been done, that they were subject to sort of gaming and information gaps, and they provided a number of examples of this. The second criticism made most vocally by the former chair was just that the courts, who were the key decision maker in mergers, were not well placed to do the kind of forward-looking analysis that's part of a merger investigation. It's a very kind of economic/commercial forward-looking piece, and that they were overly reliant on the testimony of the executives of the merger parties who had an incentive to put things in a particular way. And thirdly, just that there was types of transactions that were not getting captured. So I think you have this conversation here a lot about creeping acquisitions, where a firm will kind of hoover up a lot of small acquisitions individually that might not breach the law, but maybe collectively do. And nascent competitors, which is becoming more important in the digital world, picking up a competitor who may be small now but could be a competitive threat down the track. All of that said, not everyone agreed with those views, and the Law Council probably was the strongest body in pushing against changes, basically saying that everything was kind of working fine, moving would have a chilling effect on investment, and if the ACCC was losing cases, which it had been over an extended period, that was due to its own litigation strategies. Where we come out at the Taskforce is, I think it's pretty clear that if you're going to start with a blank piece of paper for a mergers regime, you wouldn't start where we were in Australia. We had 3 different pathways for getting mergers cleared. They had different legal standards, burdens of proof, decision makers. There was enough information to suggest there was potential at least to game the system in some ways. The Taskforce found information that only about a third of mergers in the economy were getting reviewed or visible. I think it is a fair assumption that most of those are probably unproblematic, but the ACCC were able to point to a number of problematic mergers that hadn't been notified. And it was also, I think, a valid point that different decision-making bodies had different degrees of economic sophistication. So the Taskforce looked at a range of different options, but critically look at the kind of horizontal lines. One, the question was, do you stay with a voluntary regime or do you move to a mandatory notification regime where if your merger meets certain threshold, you have to send it through the competition regulator? Second question is, who's the decision maker? Does ACCC get to make the decision with opportunity to appeal, or do we leave it as it is? Essentially, the federal court is the decision maker. And what is the test applied? And I won't go into this, but the lawyers get really excited by this. Should the ACCC have to be satisfied the merger is not likely to SLC, which effectively puts the burden on the merger parties, or should they have to convince themselves that the merger is likely to SLC, which is a kind of higher burden on the Commission? Where we landed, this is the exposure draft for these bills, currently out to consultation. It is looking at a mandatory notification system, suspensory, meaning the firms can't complete the transaction until the ACCC has finished its review. The burden essentially remains with the ACCC as it is now. The existing test holds, but with some changes. A clarification that substantial lessening of competition can include creating, strengthening or entrenching a substantial degree of market power. Essentially what that is trying to do is address that concern around nascent competitors and say that if you've already got a lot of market power, the acquisition of a firm of a given size may be more likely to raise concerns than if you are a smaller firm making that same acquisition. Second, it introduces a test of the cumulative effect of acquisitions. This is going to the creeping acquisitions problem. ACCC will be the decision maker with limited merits review from the Australian Competition Tribunal. And what this looks like in practice is a process that has pretty clearly defined exit points and timeframes. If a merger meets the threshold, it has to come in. It can either be fast track reviewed, which is a quick process, or a phase 1 determination with 30 days. Most mergers are expected to then come out at that point. If it's more complex, the ACCC can move to a phase 2 determination, which is an additional 90 days. At that point, if it believes it's going to substantially or likely to substantially lessen competition, there is an assessment of the public benefits, and the final decision can be appealed to the Competition Tribunal. So this brings it much more closely aligned with a number of international jurisdictions. It is designed to provide a bit more structure and certainty to firms in terms of timeframes when they're making their application. But as I said, that is currently all out for consultation, but I think it is likely that the government will move to something that looks along these lines. Non-compete clauses. So there are a range of different kind of restraint of trade clauses that can be in people's employment contracts. They are all being considered, but non-compete clauses are the one that's particularly generating a lot of interest and attention. These at the moment are governed by common law. with the expectation that they will be unenforceable unless they are reasonably necessary to protect the legitimate interests of the employer. But the point being is that very few people ever take their employer to court to challenge these. And so the thought is that for a lot of people, it simply deters, if they have one of these clauses, it deters them from moving because it's sitting there in their contract, which may be fine in the world that I think a lot of us thought we were in, which was that these are clauses that apply to a particular group of workers in, say, professional services firms, high income workers where there is an investment around. Firms need to invest in specific information and training for those workers that could be lost. What we've found, though, is when there's been various surveys that have been conducted as part of the Taskforce process, some from the worker side, some from the firm side. This is from Australia's Bureau of Statistics. We found about 20% of firms actually use these types of non-compete clauses. And where they use them, they tend to do so in a blanket way. So they have a kind of standard term that will imply in every employment contract from someone right at the top to your most junior staff member. We also find them right across the economy. As you can see, across a whole range of industries, not just in the context where we might expect to see them. And, you know, coming out of the worker surveys, childcare workers, yoga instructors, hairdressers, all sorts of types of workers where you can't imagine that there is a particularly strong, legitimate business rationale to be constraining these people's capacity to change employers. Why do we care? For workers, job mobility is really important for their capacity to find better matches for their skills and to get pay rises, and that's particularly true for younger workers. And for productivity overall, that ability for workers to move to areas where they're going to have higher productivity is crucially important for that macro productivity picture. And there's one study in Australia estimating that this slowdown in the pace of labour reallocation accounts for about a quarter of the slowdown in labour productivity post GFC. We're certainly not the only country looking at this. The OECD is running a process on this at the moment. Many countries have either already moved or considering moving. And there's three kind of key ways you can think of changing the rules around non-competes. One is just simply to restrict their use, which could be a blanket ban, which is the proposal in the US, or to restrict them below a certain income threshold. Second is to restrict the time period in which they can be put in contracts, so you can have them but no more than 12 months. And the third way is mandatory compensation. Okay, you may say there's a legitimate business interest here, but you need to pay for it. So effectively like paid gardening leave, if you're going to restrict someone from going to work for someone else, you have to pay them some fraction of their regular income. In theory, I think that would be expected to weed out a lot of the very low value versions of these clauses, or you can have some combination of the three. So those are all being looked at by the Taskforce. We've gone through a public consultation process and the Taskforce will be providing advice to government by the end of the year on that one. Finally, national competition policy. Everything that is old is new again in policy. So this harks back to a period of policy reform in the 90s in Australia, and I know New Zealand led and went through its own period of reform. In Australia, a lot of it was done under this banner of national competition policy. It was the period in which competition was introduced to a lot of the essential infrastructure sectors. We tried to introduce greater price signals in areas like road transport and water for efficient use. There was a national third-party access regime so that people could obtain regulated access to essential infrastructure services. And there was a legislation review program that basically looked across the breadth, particularly of state regulations, and said, well, if they're impeding competition and they can't identify a significant net benefit, then those should be wound back. So it went over more than a decade. It was essentially an agreement with the state treasurers and the federal treasurer. They all sat around a table. They agreed on a set of principles. States then went away and came up with a set of reforms that fit under those principles. We had an independent body in the National Competition Council monitoring their progress in delivering those reforms. and if they delivered, there was money on the table. And it was pretty sizable, about $5.5 billion over 9 years. And that was a pretty critical part of its success, as I'll come to. Very briefly, Productivity Commission reviewed this. We found quite substantial boosts to economic activity, particularly in those infrastructure sectors from the reforms, as well as some other benefits in terms of price reduction, business innovation, and in some cases environmental goals. It was a kind of golden era for productivity in Australia as it was for New Zealand. And when we went back and kind of looked at why those reforms worked, there were a number of kind of elements to the success. One was that we had pretty good evidence base for them. A lot of work had been done on what needed to happen. Two, there was kind of political leadership. There was a real buy-in from the different levels of government that were needed to make this happen. By running it as a broad-based reform program, there was a sense that it actually made it easier to get change. And this is something that's often debated, but I think here it was clear that individual losers were kind of drowned out by the fact that there was this kind of bigger package where people could talk about the broader benefits. There was transparency and accountability built in. You couldn't just say you were going to do something. We could see whether or not you'd done it, and we had an independent umpire making a call on that. It kind of forced a degree of rigour in the policy-making process through the public interest test assessments. That kind of cost-benefit analysis was there on the public record. And finally, the financial incentives were actually really important for disrupting the political economy. Obviously, states get excited by money, and they were keen to get those incentives, but it also gave them political cover when they're talking to their constituencies. These things are hard to do, and to say, oh, no, we have to change retail trading hours because otherwise we're going to lose this money from the federal government, made it easier for them to do some of those hard things. So where is this going? Essentially, there's been an in-principle agreement to try and revigorate this process of sitting down and coming up with a tranche of reforms. This is still under negotiation, so everything I've put in this slide is my view only and the Commission's view only of things that could be on the list. Do not take it as signal of government policy in any way. But certainly in our view, there's plenty of things we could be doing under this banner. There's a whole lot of stuff that didn't get completely done under Mark 1 around trading hours, location rules for pharmacies, parallel importation, planning and zoning. And there's also a whole lot of new things that we think could be on the list around data sharing to improve competition, adoption of overseas standards for products generally, but that's particularly relevant in areas to do with the green transition, where the opportunity to bring in cheap imports to meet our net zero goals will be important. In health, I'm guessing you might have the same thing here, but we have a ton of restrictions on who can do what in the health system, some of which, of course, are needed, but some of which seem to be geared towards restricting competition from different groups. Labour markets, we've still got some way to go on mutual recognition of occupational licences and big questions around the way we recognise overseas qualifications, which is really important because we have a very significant skilled migration program. And transport infrastructure, still some way to go around price signals and efficient use as well. So these are all things that could be on the table. The process from here is, this is kind of negotiation period between Commonwealth and state governments, but the idea is it will replicate the original NCP and that we'll have several tranches of reform, probably the opportunity for payments on the table. And, as the head of the Productivity Commission, this gets me excited because, frankly, like a lot of this has been off the agenda for a long time, and this is really a vehicle to try and introduce some of these micro policy changes that we think can make a difference to productivity. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That's absolutely fascinating. I think exciting for everybody here as well to hear about the potential to drive competition. I was really struck by the parallels as you were kind of stepping through the evidence of some of the causes of lower productivity growth recently, and how many parallels we have between what we see in New Zealand and what you've outlined in Australia and elsewhere in the world. And also fascinating to hear about some of the really specific solutions that Australia is considering, some of which are relevant here, and others which we may need to consider. But we'll open up for questions and discussion. We'll alternate between the room and online. Would anyone like to kick us off? In the front.
Thanks very much for that. There are three things that strike me, and I wonder if you'd comment on each of the three. Number one, the evidence of rising margins is available at macro as well as micro level, and we've done work in New Zealand showing that about 10% of GDP at the moment is rental payments going to mainly corporate interests that aren't explicable in terms of return on investment. And so the reason why that's happening is sometimes suggested to be intangibles, and you mentioned intangibles, and the evidence seems to be that the rising margins do not go along with a rise in productivity. If they were due to an increase in payments for intangibles, we would expect those intangibles to actually translate into productivity gains, and they don't appear to. So I just wondered if you could nail a little bit more what the Productivity Commission in Australia is doing about the claim that there are massive intangibles which explained all this rent income being collected without an obvious payoff. Number two, you mentioned the public benefit test or public interest test. Now, in New Zealand, our public benefit test excludes all distributional considerations within the economy. So a transfer of income from a consumer to a supplier is not considered a public detriment. I wonder, do you have the same thing in Australia? I mean, because that seems to be, that's something that I've been very upset about in New Zealand. I've lost my course about it, so let's leave it at that.
I can only keep two in my head at the same time anyway. Thank you. Both great questions. Look, let me take the second one first because I'm not sure if I have a clear answer, but we have much less experience with public benefits assessment in the mergers regime. It only applies under our authorisation regime, which has not been used terribly often. And I don't know if it's kind of the full range of public benefits are clearly specified. My guess is that it is the same, in that I think economists would say you're probably more worried about kind of efficiency than distributional questions. I know there have been some recent interesting ones on public benefits where they've taken into account emissions reductions, for example, the opportunity to get to the net zero targets sooner, and actually they were seen as substantial enough to outweigh the competitive detriment from the merger. But there's been I think only kind of less than a handful of mergers actually assessed under the authorisation regime and the public benefits test. So we're actually not as well established as you guys in considering, I think, what might apply there. On the first question, I was interested when you said your research has found at an industry level this increase in margins. What time period over which? Yeah.
It certainly, essentially, in the national accounts, that's not accounted for by any of the sort of usual explanations, and so we're regarding that as effectively an increase in margins.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, because I was thinking if it was short term, obviously we've got all the kind of dynamic around inflation playing out. I mean, so you would think intangibles is then playing a role, and that was similar to the slide that I put up with the kind of margins in the digitally intensive industries versus others, and you'd seen that stronger increase. And yes, over time you would expect that would flow through to the productivity numbers. I mean,
theory and argument that more monopoly profit gives you more investment and more innovation and so on appears to be empirically not a starter in this setting, but it's an open question.
But it depends. So if you think it's kind of pure rents, I mean, it's that if you think that, it's pure economic rents, it's certainly not showing up in the kind of investment data. but it can be other forms of investment that are just not getting picked up.
They should emerge in productivity.
But they should then emerge in productivity. Agreed.
And they don't.
They do. We can never see the counterfactual, but that's right. That's the mystery at the heart of this, I think, that we're not seeing that show up. Yeah. And so there is, sorry, just to quickly cover that off. There are arguments with these kind of big generalized changes in technology that you always go through this kind of S-curve effect, and it just takes us a while to learn how we're going to use them before we see these kind of expansions in use case. And I'm kind of optimistic about AI, for example, as being a potentially big productivity driver, but certainly it's not looked spectacular in the data yet.
A question online, and make this maybe a two-part question as well. We have one on data sharing, and question is whether your view on the question is what your view is on consumer data right work is around the world. Querying that the evidence for it seems to be a little bit patchy. We see really low rates of switching in some industries, so utilities is a big one, of course. And so, what can governments do to set the standards to encourage more switching, more competition? But I'm wondering if we can also build on that to go back to some of our conversation earlier this morning about data more broadly and how data and evidence can be used. You talked about as one of the factors for success in competition policy reform in the past in Australia. And so what sort of developments do you see in data and evidence that gives you optimism?
So the problem of lack of customer switching in essential services is definitely universal. And, I've seen so much work go into this question. This is something I've changed my mind on over time. I just think it is basically impossible to get people to engage. So let me take a very extreme example from Australia. So we did all the stuff that you're supposed to do around information and making switching easy. I'll come to the consumer data right in a moment, but this was in terms of government websites set up to help consumers compare electricity providers. And they were great. Like I had a go. I hadn't switched for ages. I'm a victim of this apathy myself. I saved a ton of money. It was really easy. People still weren't switching. So the Victorian government, back in the days when they had money, said, we're going to pay people $300 just to go to the site. So anyone that went to the site, and probably you were going to switch while you're there and also save money, was going to get $300. And still barely anyone went. You can put all this money on the table, but people, it's just, they've got a lot going on in their lives. You'll have a small group of engaged people that are really good at this, but the vast bulk, it's just always going to be difficult. And I've kind of increasingly come of the view that you just have to have minimum protections built in for the disengaged group, which is the vast majority, because relying on consumer switching is not going to be enough to get you there. Consumer data right is designed to kind of improve the capacity to make switching easier to, particularly in areas like banking, where it can be a real hassle to move everything across, to make that seamless, to open those markets up to competition. The PC was a big advocate for the consumer data right. It has been rolled out in Australia in banking and electricity, with the view that it would be rolled out more broadly in the economy. It's fair to say it hasn't been a huge success, at least to date. A lot of money and time has gone in. There hasn't been huge evidence of consumer take-up. Treasury is currently doing a review. So I think we will learn something from that process about what maybe we could have done better. But it certainly, hasn't yet had the impacts that we were hoping that it would have. Sorry, more optimism. This is all very bleak. So I still am hopeful that we can at least improve capacity through things like the consumer data right. In the policy world, I think there has been a transformation in policy thinking and policy work through the types of data that we are able to get access to. So all the slides that I put up, for example, are using our business longitudinal data set that allows you to kind of interrogate firm level data. The corollary for that at a person level in Australia is called our applied data set. It allows you to have person level data on any interaction with the system. So you can, look at people using health services by their taxable income. So you can answer all sorts of questions about health inequity or regional inequities in health. We just did a really cool piece of work looking at intergenerational mobility. So you can also link people's tax returns with their parents and see how much people are, there's just so many cool policy questions we can now answer. And that's, this data is incredible, and it's really been spearheaded by our ABS kind of making it available, pushing for greater linkages, trying to make it as usable as possible. There's still some way to go, I can assure you, but it has been a real revolution, I think, in our capacity to do high quality evidence-based policy work.
Hello, thank you for such a fascinating presentation. One thing I just would encourage you to talk about is the strategy for, the policy strategy that's been chosen here, which identifies some of these things but not others. And that's just because I see, there's a risk of maybe being a bit too incremental. Like we've gone from low levels of concentration to really high levels of concentration, yet the things we're focusing on is stopping further concentration. So I'm wondering how we think about what the right things to do are at a high level, and how you got to the things you chose there as part of the policy strategy.
First of all, I'll say I did not choose them. That is the work of the Taskforce, and we are merely on the advisory board. But I think the strategy was, let's look for the areas that we think are big and will make a difference, and the things that we think we can achieve. So rather than doing this kind of tome that could sit on the shelf and cover everything, it's a really different approach, but I kind of like it. It's like, let's pick out these individual things that we think are important and kind of run them down the whole way through doing the research, doing the advocacy for change, and really giving the government something very practical that they can pick up. So that was the kind of the thinking, and the combination of the kind of mergers, which, as you say, I'll come back to the other part of your question, picks up the, how do we stop concentration from getting worse? Non-competes picks up the labour market issues, which were seen as very real. And then the NCP is actually quite bold and ambitious, and it kind of covers a whole suite of different areas. There's debate about, what else can governments do? I mean, I think the regulatory stuff is really important, removing all the impediments that government controls to competition. There are debates that percolate and, picked up there around whether you want to have divestiture powers. It's certainly been raised with the Taskforce. I think there's not a strong appetite to go down that route. It is, they are very, very significant change. There's all sorts of thorny challenges in implementation. I think you can end up spending a lot of time tied up in knots for something that's probably going to be very, very rarely used. And we see in countries where they have it, it's not, it's extremely rare. That said, I noted in the OECD discussion of New Zealand and the competition policy chapter, it did say that maybe that should be on the agenda here as a smaller market. That wasn't, interestingly, they had quite different language in Australia. So I think it may well be that the kind of the degree of challenge here is such that they wanted to put a different set of policy remedies on the table, but it's certainly not something that the Taskforce is progressing at this point.
Switch back to online. We have a question about the role of globalisation. So you presented some evidence on increasing concentration. And to what extent do you think that might be driven by globalisation? So firms who are dominating domestic markets as they're seeking to gain scale for international markets. Perhaps more broadly, though, the impact or the interaction, I guess, between global competition and domestic competition, and how you think about that as a policy maker as well, when you can only control the domestic levers.
It's a really great question. I mean, my prior would be it may affect the market concentration measures, but it should go the other way when it comes to competition, in the sense that import competition is a very real thing. So if your markets are not competitive and it's sectors where you can buy from all over the world, open trade should mean that that's increasing competition in those segments where we previously didn't have competition. The link between competition and trade more generally, though, is an interesting one. So we used to have a lot of arguments in Australia about this kind of idea of national champions. So we need to kind of allow high levels of market concentration or single firms to dominate markets, because that's the kind of scale that we're going to need to go out and compete on a global stage. But really, I think the jury kind of didn't come in favour of that. What we found was that those firms, if they weren't tested at home, usually they weren't particularly good at competing internationally. So actually kind of a more competitive local market provided the impetus for firms that would actually be good at competing globally. We also have, a set of firms that have an inherent advantage in competing globally. We have stuff in the ground that they can dig out, but those big trading sectors like mining and agricultural are extremely productive. So the Australian mining sector, I think, is the most productive in the world. They have, automated absolutely everything. You have these driverless trains. It is, like the tech involved is pretty incredible. So you can see that they've kind of either it is that those sectors themselves are just more amenable to the kind of productivity gains, but also it looks like that they've had to respond to that kind of international pressure.
Might have been uncharacteristically brief. So I'm interested in your point about the large firms buying small firms, because I was thinking about dynamic competition. So high markups can be the reward for competition, as well as so it can be the sign that the resources have been allocated towards the most efficient or the most knowledge intensive or whatever. So in that world, incumbents could they can outsource the risk to R&D by buying small companies, and a policy perspective, we kind of trade. You think, well, there's a trade-off there between they're good at getting ideas to scale, so maybe the sort of the lack of competition is outweighed by a kind of efficiency kind of thing. But it's an entirely rational thing for an incumbent to do, to buy those small firms. So I think it's a really interesting idea, and I'm interested to think, how would that work? How would you actually design a policy that would do something like that? I'm really interested.
I mean, you're still inherent in the test. You've still got to kind of meet the thresholds. So you still have to show that it's going to substantially lessen competition. There's just, the argument is that because you're already bigger, you're more likely to tip into meeting that threshold with a smaller acquisition. You can make those arguments via the net benefits test. That's the public benefits test, is designed to kind of pick up on questions around innovation.
But if the small firm's got an incentive to keep that knowledge to itself because it's its competitive advantage, where would that information come from in order to make that informed decision? That's what I'm intrigued about.
So how does the regulator...
So in order to do a public interest test, I would say this small company here has got a new amazing idea that might overthrow this big company here. It may be that the only two companies that know about that are the people buying and the people selling. How would a public body find that out?
Regulators have a lot of power to get a lot of stuff. So they can do document requests, they can do compulsory interviews. It would generally be known about it in the market. They have good ways of probing these questions. But the more general point you make is an interesting one, and it has sat behind a lot of this debate. So on the one hand, we've had big tech companies kind of hoovering up a whole lot of smaller competitors. I think inevitably that has meant that what could emerge as potential challenges have been closed off before they started, and that's taken us to the point we are now. On the other hand, there's a question of that's become a business strategy for those smaller companies, and they come in and do that R&D on the basis that they expect to be brought out by Google. So I think it is a relevant consideration when we're thinking about the kind of broader economy-wide effects and how you kind of balance that. I hope it can be done through the kind of tools that exist there, but it's certainly something that people have thought about and grappled with.
So Danielle, thank you. Unfortunately, that takes us to the end of our time. I'm sure we could continue, but that has been an absolutely fascinating presentation, really thought-provoking tour of competition policy issues from the more strategic policy questions. Really appreciate how you stepped through some of the evidence around productivity and some really specific solutions that are being considered in Australia. And also really struck by your reflections on some of the broader conditions that are required for success, or that we've learned about success in this space. So the importance of evidence, the political leadership, taking a broad-based approach given the various interests at play, financial incentives. I mean, one of the features of the system here is no states, but nonetheless, financial incentives do make a difference. But that has just been terrific. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for joining in today. Our next guest lecture is on Wednesday, 4th of December. We've got Sebastian Barnes from the OECD Economics Department talking about independent fiscal councils, which is sure to be a terrific presentation as well. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Danielle. And thanks again, everybody, for attending. I'll close with our Treasury karakia, Piki te kaha, Piki te ora, Piki te wairua, Huie, Tai Kie. Kia ora tātou. Thank you.